Well, to wrap up the ANC policy conference and some of the salient points that came out of the conference, we're joined now this evening in the studio by political analyst Sandile Swana, who is to my left, and Professor Booysen to my right. Thank you both for joining us. Let me just start with you, Professor Booysen. Just in terms of the president of the ANC, characterizing the ANC as alive and well, as evidenced by the policy conference and the outcomes. Your thoughts on that, on not only the legitimacy of his leadership, but the people that he leads with. And this is amidst the socio-economic strife that we're seeing in South Africa at the moment. Do you think that resonates with the people of South Africa?
Oh, yes, it was Cyril Ramaphosa, president, who worked very hard in today's deliberations, his closing address, and through the conference to persuade the electorate that this is a party that is alive and well, that renewal and rebuilding is really taking shape as this mantra for this ANC under him, and to create the image with the electorate out there that this is a party that can be trusted to stay true to that step aside, epitomizing the action against corruption. So it finds a lot of resonance among people out there, potential voters, but he was really working hard to get that, to get peace and to get that mantra instilled in his own party. As we also saw that there was resistance against the step aside. It is continuous resistance, and speaking to delegates at the conference informally, some of them said, yes, it's peaceful now, but December, when it comes to the elective conference, it may be something else. So it's a party that in other parts of the conference was really emphasized that this is at its weakest moment ever, and membership in good standing, for example, that is known now to be around 600,000, which for the ANC is very low. At the time of his centenary celebrations in 2012, that was around 1.1, close to 1.2 million. So for members in good standing, that is very low. And what we hear and seen from the branches, also the policy preparedness that they brought into this conference, that was quite low. And this comes at a time, ANC weak organizationally, despite the president trying to persuade us that it's not, when the challenges are the biggest ever.
Mr. Booysen, hold a thought about policy preparedness, and we'll get to that and pick out some of the more important ones. Mr. Swana, let me come to you on the issue of what Professor Booysen is saying, the road to December. You know, just speaking on the State Security Agency itself, we had David Mahlobo speak about the need to do away with politicization and interference, and we've seen the government and the state aspersions cast on it, not only other institutions of government but arms of the state. We've seen the judiciary come under fire and questions raised about its integrity. And I say all of this against the backdrop of the ANC trying to convince us that all is well, because now they're going to institute lifestyle audits, something that we promised for a long time. The question I'm asking, are all of those elements of smokes and mirrors, is it a cosmetic outcome really that we're seeing and hearing?
It's the big question there is that can we take these words that they are uttering seriously? Because when you go back to 2007, in Polokwane, their conference in Polokwane around 2007, they started talking about this renewal process, etc., etc. And then right up to 2017. Now it's 5 years. This conference happens every 5 years. But when you look at what has actually happened, in recent times, you've had more municipalities run by the ANC going into administration, including one metro, Mangaung, going into presidential administration. So when you look at the reports that come out of the Auditor General, it's getting worse, actually. When you listen to Sidney Mafumadi, who is running the security cluster, if you like, under the presidency, trying to get the security cluster right, he says, look, whether you like it or not, we're likely to have another insurrection of some kind in the near future. And the Sasria has also increased, the premiums have increased in terms of expecting more riots in the near future, and so on and so forth. So when you look at hard numbers that come from credible institutions within the state, such as the Auditor General, Sasria, and others, and the people who are trying to fix the security cluster, there is a problem. And of course, the issues that you are mentioning, some of the very top leaders of the ANC, every now and again, they stray off and you find them attacking the judiciary and all those types of things. So it's a very difficult period, but for the ordinary South African, between now and 2024, when we've got to go to the vote, what is it that the ANC will have fixed? Will it have taken municipalities out of administration? Will those municipalities be top performing? Will we have enough policing in our areas and enjoying security? What is it that they can give us in the next 18 months or so after the December conference? That is really what matters. I don't think South Africans are looking for a fancy speech from President Ramaphosa. They just want to get the deliverables.
And Professor Booysen, let's get to that and back to your statement about policy preparedness. Just listening to various reactions, some have labeled the outcomes of this policy conference, one, as a rehash of their last policy conference. Secondly, others have said the ANC is very reductionist in its approach, particularly referring to the issue of crime. There was the issue of Lindiwe Sisulu speaking about chemical castration as a possible measure, even though it was under discussion. What I'm saying is that there is a sense that the ANC is being reactionary, emotive, as opposed to going back to the drawing board and applying the basic principles of the policies that they have in place. What are your thoughts about this? And this also goes to the issue of ESCOM, by the way. There was the issue of ESCOM 2.0. Apparently that didn't even come under discussion.
Yes. The discussions were, by all reports, quite haphazard. And if one listened to the ministers and to other senior government and ANC officials reporting back to in media briefings, it was pretty uncoordinated image, very variable across different policy fields. And I found generally a huge amount of disconnect. It's a unique thing, quite unique of the ANC. They can talk about all the problems, all the crises in government. Certainly, yes, parts of it in terms of global financial conditions and crises, etc. And COVID, not all of it was the ANC and ANC government's fault, but much of the current crises that we have been solely, or to a large extent, by lack of action, insufficient policy action, policy implementation also in the years preceding this. And I was quite disappointed with the fact that we have these huge crises, health crises, education crises, local government crises. Local government, the response was a very generic one, a total overall, and sort of allusions here and there to possibly district development model, and the road going there that they will negotiate with the people in there. It is a long road. There were a few vague references to the electoral system, uncertain exactly where they're steering it to. And if we look at the education and health crises, these are massive societal crises in South Africa, but small stabs like in, yes, national health insurance will come, we'll look at funding, basic income grant, necessary, and defining, bear in mind the resources are to come, or education, look at overcrowding, health, get more ambulances. Those were the kind of responses that were offered by the people who debriefed the media, for example, and analysts in that process. So there was a mismatch between the scope of the problem and the solutions that seemed to be on offer.
Mr. Swana, does that incoherence extend to, we've seen the party bemoan the caliber of cadre that it has been able to attract And I'm wondering if its ideological trajectory is also being watered down in its bid to stay in power. There was a report on the issue of expropriation of land without compensation, for instance, saying that the ANC should not abandon the stance, instead of garner support from other opposition parties. But there are people even within the party who have said what the ANC has done is to pander. The issue of the ANC not being a socialist party. So while we know that they consider themselves as a broad church, is this something that is undercutting what they really want to stand for? One of the first things that was said was policy conferences are meant to showcase the character and nature of the ANC as a party. Did that come through ideologically? Yes.
Some people have made these statements, and I think some of the top leaders of the ANC, including the likes of Mbeki, the likes of Kgalema Motlhande, have made the statement about the quality of the individual cadre of the ANC. So since the Mandela presidency, in my judgment, the caliber, the average quality of the ANC cadre has deteriorated. Now, in that deterioration, you have the clear problem of ideological deterioration, because for you to have a certain amount of ideological depth and clarity, you need to be a person of quality and well-trained. Then you also get the other problem as your quality of cadre declines, of technocratic deficiencies. In other words, where you start to have non-evidence-based planning of things. In other words, there's just shallowness. For instance, I'm sitting there thinking right now, people are busy talking about immigrants coming to take up jobs in South Africa. Then the question is, if we're to take, how many are these immigrants that have taken these jobs? If we're to get rid of them, out of the 12 million unemployed South Africans, how many would actually get jobs? And what would that do to the unemployment problem in South Africa? And sometimes, I mean, people like Cyril Ramaphosa would come up from the start and say, I'm going to create 185,000 jobs this year. But how many are you supposed to create in the first place? My calculation, when he said that, my calculation was that he needed to create 1.5 million jobs a year, minimum. But it just throws a number. So you find that as we progress, this deterioration of the cadre, the ANC becomes less systematic in what it is doing, and it is unable to provide systemic solutions. They can tell you that we have a systemic problem, but their solutions are not systemic. So the quality, and you cannot become that quality, that top quality cadre, without intensive and continuous training over a period of time. So indeed, there is a sense in which the ANC is becoming, in my judgment, an intellectual desert.
Professor Booysen, just in terms of the economic plan, I mean, the ANC makes it clear that it consults widely, but we've heard it in the past that the various economic development plans that they've undertaken have been criticized as being neoliberal in their nature. Now, let's take privatization, for instance. It's been accused of flirting with it, yet at the same time still claiming that the importance of state-owned entities must not be overlooked. Its management of its fiscus and monetary policy. There's the July unrest that Mr. Swana was speaking about earlier, because that's what it comes down to, grassroots understanding and feeling like their government is in tune with their plight, the issue of joblessness. I mean, employment, public works, employment opportunities, we keep being told about that, applying money into infrastructure so that we can create jobs. All of these things are things that keep coming up almost at an academic level. Should the public be convinced that this is an ANC government that deserves to rule them, govern them in 2024? As some people have been raising the questions that perhaps there is a case to be made for coalition governments.
Yes, that's fascinating, that issue. And one could hear it and hear that urgency and recognition, implicit recognition of this gap between the distance, gap between the ANC and the branches on the one side and people on the other side, with so much emphasis in the rhetoric and the narratives in this conference on that connection, working with people, branches reaching out, educating not just their own people, but persuading the broader citizenry out there that this is a party that is connected and really cares for the people, the broader South African public out there. There's a lot of emphasis on that, and Ramaphosa really giving a huge task then to the branches, also in his closing address today, emphasizing that how they have to reach out and really work miracles in these 4.5 months to the elective conference and then until 2024. But it's a huge task for the ANC because there are so many crises, and the ANC having been in power for 28 years, there can hardly any fingers that can be pointed. And then coming to coalition government, we heard the Minister David Matlobo, for example, in his briefing emphasizing that, it's adverse forces and its opposition parties that are responsible for the instability, whereas it's exactly a total denial in there that it's exactly been the ANC that has been hugely responsible for instability, where there have been new coalition governments, and that they have been refusing to accept that role as opposition and coming into coalitions and breaking up coalitions, doing their best to do that. So there's that denial of that I see in the ANC midst of responsibility for many other problems that are around us. And yes, the voters would have to be persuaded that this is ANC that can actually do things better and do things clearly in the interests of people, a broader group of people out there.
Because we have run out of time, there's a policy document that was also put forth, that of progressive internationalism, given the position that the ANC has taken up to play a role in the issue of Russia, Ukraine, and a non-alignment. But as you mentioned earlier on, the party has its own problems in terms of dealing with, more importantly, its regional neighbors, in terms of how the foreign nationals being in our country is undeniably draining the resources, scarce resources of South Africans. But the xenophobic sentiment coming out of people who are naturally exhausted from having to deal with a crime that is not being dealt with by the law enforcement institutions, and as we mentioned earlier on, the socio-economic challenges that are the responsibility of the state but have now seemingly been passed on to those that are closest to them, that they could easily point a finger at, and that is the presence of foreign nationals. Did the ANC manage to strike the right note in the fact that as a regional partner in the development of Africa, it is cognizant of the challenges of all, but most importantly, being, accountable to its own people?
Let's just first of all accept that during times of stress, whether you are in the UK, we've seen this in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, and Trump also played the card of targeting foreigners in the United States of America, a nation of immigrants, and so on and so forth. Now, during times of poor leadership, let's put it that way, because most crises are precipitated by poor leadership in the first place. So I'll say this, that the failures over a very long time, since 2008, of the African National Congress, have actually created the crisis, economic crisis, to the point that the foreigner in South Africa will be consumed by the local population. And after consuming the foreigner, the problems that they face will remain in any event. So the question that the economic growth rate in South Africa needs to go above 5%. And comrades are still talking about 2%, trying to get to 2%, and so on and so forth. So those are the problems. So it's easy It's the easiest way, and Ramaphosa and company are in that milieu of simply pointing fingers, and Mutsualedi and all of them are there. There are security problems about foreigners. The problem of crime is crime, and Mahlobo is right in that. But the problem that we've created of porous borders, where our passports are used by terrorists, where we are now accused of funding, allowing our country to be a base for funding terrorism, those are some of the issues that we're in. We were not able, we are incapacitated, we're not able to silence the gun in Cabo Delgado, intervene in the region and silence terrorism and all those types of things. And in Africa, South Africa has lost the leadership battle, and that could have actually stimulated a lot of trade and a lot of economic development. The past, since 2008, that whole period from an economic point of view, it has been totally lost.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for wrapping up the ANC's policy conference, sixth policy conference. Political analyst Sandile Swana and Professor Susam Booysen. Well, that's where we're going to leave it for now. But of course, we'll continue reflecting on some of the outcomes of the policy conference, particularly the issue of crime. Much focus has been on what's happened in Krugersdorp. As we mentioned earlier on, the police minister, Bheki Cele, was there visiting some of the victims and their family members, appealing to the public to give them privacy. We'll hear now from community members about just how perennial these problems have been and what police themselves have done or have been doing to come to their aid, if at all. All that and more coming up here on The Globe. Don't go away.